The wind coming down from the Absaroka Range carried the scent of snow long before the first flake fell. It was a biting, thin air that tasted of pine needles and impending frost. Caleb Bracken adjusted the collar of his buffalo hide coat, feeling the familiar stiff bristles against his neck. He sat atop his roan gelding, a beast as scarred and sure-footed as its rider, and looked down into the valley where the town of Bitter Creek sprawled like a brown stain on the golden prairie grass. He did not like coming down. Up in the high timber, the rules were simple. If you were careless, you died. If you were lazy, you starved. If you respected the land, it might just let you live another season. Down here, among the clapboard buildings and the muddy streets churned by wagon wheels, the rules were twisted by money and manners. Two things Caleb possessed in short supply. He urged the horse forward, his pack mule tugging reluctantly on the lead rope behind him. Caleb was 40 years old, though the sun and the wind had etched lines into his face that made him look 10 years older. He was a large man, built with the heavy, dense muscle of someone who lifted logs and hauled elk quarters for survival. His beard was dark and thick, streaked with premature iron gray, and his eyes were the color of wet slate, watchful and unblinking. As he rode onto the main thoroughfare, the noise of the town assaulted him. Blacksmith hammers rang against anvils. Dogs barked at the heels of passing carriages, and the murmur of voices drifted from the open doors of saloons. People stopped to watch him pass. He was a spectacle, a wild thing dragged in from the wilderness. His buckskins were stained with grease and blood, and he carried a smell of wood smoke and animal musk that cut through the town's sense of coal dust and horse manure. He tied his animals to the hitching rail outside Miller's General Mercantile. He patted the mule's neck, a rare gesture of affection, before pushing open the door. A bell chimed overhead, a delicate tinkling sound that seemed absurdly fragile to his ears. The store was warm, heated by a pot-belly stove in the center of the room. It smelled of roasted coffee beans, cured leather, and spices brought in from the east. Caleb moved to the counter, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He felt the eyes of the other customers on him. Two women in calico dresses whispered behind their hands near the fabric bolts. A clerk in a starched collar looked up, his nose wrinkling slightly. Caleb ignored them. He pulled a crumpled list from his pocket. He could read and write, a skill his mother had drilled into him before the fever took her 30 years ago, but he did not like to show it. He laid the paper on the counter. 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt, coffee, sugar, lead, powder, a new axe handle. The clerk took the list with 2 fingers, as if it were soiled. Caleb turned his back to the counter, leaning against the wood, and waited. His gaze swept the room, looking for nothing in particular, just keeping watch. That was when he saw her. She stood near the front window, bathed in the pale afternoon light that filtered through the glass. She was young, perhaps 19, with hair the color of spun gold piled high on her head in a fashion that looked impossibly complicated. Her dress was a deep blue velvet, far too fine for a Monday afternoon in a frontier town, and she held a parasol even though she was indoors. Clarabelle Harlow was laughing. It was a bright, musical sound, like water over stones, but there was an edge to it. She was surrounded by 2 other young women and a young man in a suit who looked like he had never swung a hammer in his life. Caleb stared. He had not seen a woman like that in years. In the mountains, beauty was functional. A beautiful tree was one that provided shelter. A beautiful river was one that held trout. Clarabelle was beautiful in a way that served no purpose other than to be looked at. She looked soft. She looked clean. The loneliness that Caleb kept buried deep in his gut, the hollow ache that usually only troubled him during the long, silent nights of January, suddenly flared hot and sharp. He had built a good cabin this year. He had laid in enough meat for 3 people. He had traded well last spring and had a gold coin buried in a tin beneath his floorboards. He was a man of substance, in his own way. He watched her tilt her head back, exposing the long, white line of her throat. She looked warm, without thinking, without planning. Caleb pushed himself off the counter. His heart hammered against his ribs, a sensation he had not felt since he faced a grizzly sow 2 winters past. He walked toward her. The floorboards creaked under his weight. The chatter in the store died away as his shadow fell over the group. Clarabelle stopped laughing. She turned, her blue eyes widening as she took in the towering figure before her. The young man in the suit took a nervous step back. Caleb stopped 3 feet from her. He held his hat in his hands, his fingers crushing the brim. He searched for words, but his tongue felt thick and useless. He had gone months without speaking to another human soul. The sophisticated language of courtship was a foreign country to him. He looked at her, his slate eyes intense and unsmiling. "You look like someone who would keep a man warm in winter," he said. It was meant to be a compliment. In his mind, it was the highest praise. Winter was death. To keep a man warm was to keep him alive. It was an offer of protection, a statement of need, a promise of value. For a heartbeat. There was silence. Clarabelle stared at him, her mouth slightly open. She looked at his scarred hands, his stained buckskins, the knife strapped to his thigh. Then she looked at his face, reading the naked, clumsy vulnerability there. A giggle escaped her lips, then another. The young man in the suit smirked. Clarabelle covered her mouth, but the laughter spilled out, high and cruel. "Oh, my heavens," she gasped, looking at her friends. "Did you hear that? He thinks I am a blanket." The other girls dissolved into giggles. "I suppose I should take it as a compliment," Clarabelle said, her voice raising so the whole store could hear. "But I'm afraid, sir, that you would smell like a wet dog even if I did set you on fire to keep warm." The store erupted. The clerk chuckled behind the counter. The women at the fabric bolts hid their smiles. The young man in the suit let out a loud, barking laugh, emboldened by the girl's dismissal. Caleb stood frozen. The heat rushed up his neck, burning his ears. He felt a physical blow to his chest, harder than any fist. He had expected a no. He had not expected this. He had forgotten that in the civilized world, honesty was often treated as a joke. He put his hat back on his head, pulling the brim low to hide his eyes. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He turned on his heel, the heavy thud of his boots sounding like a funeral march in the sudden quiet that followed the laughter. From the shadows near the back of the store, a woman watched him go. Eleanor Harlow stood with one hand resting on a barrel of dried beans. She was 38 years old, dressed in a gown of severe gray wool that she wore like armor. She was still beautiful, though her beauty was sharper, colder than her daughter's. Her hair was dark, pulled back tightly, and her eyes were the same blue as Clarabelle's, but without the mirth. She had watched the entire exchange. She had seen the raw hope in the mountain man's eyes, a hope so pure it was painful to witness. And she had seen her daughter crush it like a bug under her heel, for no other reason than to amuse her friends. Eleanor felt a familiar twisting in her stomach. It was a mixture of shame and rage. She looked at Clarabelle, who was wiping tears of laughter from her eyes, preening under the adoration of her sycophants. Eleanor saw her late husband in that gesture. She saw the same casual cruelty that had defined 18 years of her life. The mountain man walked out the door, his back straight, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. Eleanor looked down at her gloved hands. They were trembling. She made a fist, digging her fingernails into her palms until the pain centered her. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. Caleb did not leave town immediately. He had his supplies packed tight in the panniers on his mule, but the mountain passes were treacherous in the dark. He would leave at first light. He found a spot behind the livery stable, away from the main street. He did not want a room at the hotel. He did not want to be within 4 walls. He sat on a log, wrapped in his coat, smoking a pipe. The tobacco was harsh and biting, grounding him. The town was celebrating something, a harvest dance, perhaps. The sound of a fiddle drifted through the cold air, frantic and cheerful. He could hear the stomping of boots on floorboards from the town hall 100 yards away. It sounded like a different world, a world he was barred from entering. He watched the smoke curl up from his pipe. He was a fool. He knew that now. He had let the silence of the high country trick him into thinking he could just ask for what he needed. He touched the scar on his hand, a souvenir from a Union saber during the war. He should have known better. Footsteps approached. They were soft, not the heavy tread of a man. Caleb stiffened but did not turn. He expected it was one of the saloon girls coming to see if the trapper had a coin, or perhaps a child daring to get close to the bear man. Mr. Bracken. The voice was low, cultured, and steady. Caleb turned his head slowly. A woman stood at the edge of the firelight from the stable lantern. It was the woman from the store, the one in the gray dress, the mother. He stood up. It was instinct to stand when a lady approached, a habit his mother had whipped into him before he could walk. He tapped his pipe out on his boot heel and shoved it into his pocket. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was gravel, unused to softness. Eleanor Harlow stepped closer. She had wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders, but she still looked out of place among the muck and straw of the stable yard. She looked at him. Her chin lifted. "I wish to apologize," she said. Caleb frowned. "Apologize." "For my daughter," she continued. "Clarabelle, her behavior today it was beneath contempt. It was cruel." Caleb looked away, towards the dark outline of the mountains. "It does not matter," he said. "She was right. I am a rough man. I had no business asking." "You had every business," Eleanor said, her voice sharpening slightly. "You offered an honest proposal. It deserved an honest answer, not ridicule." Caleb looked back at her. He saw her face clearly now in the lantern light. She looked tired, not the physical tiredness of a day's work, but the deep, marrow-weary exhaustion of a soul that has carried a heavy load for too long. "Why are you here?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. She looked toward the town hall, where the music was growing louder. She could picture Clarabelle inside, dancing, flirting, completely unaware of the wreckage she left in her wake. Eleanor thought of the empty house waiting for her, the silence that was not peaceful but suffocating. She thought of the whispers in town, the men who looked at her widowhood as an opportunity for property acquisition, the women who waited for her to slip. She looked back at Caleb. He was big. Yes, frightening to some, but she saw how he stood. He stood like a tree that had weathered storms. He was solid. He was real. There was no artifice in him. "I am here," she said slowly, "because I am tired of apologies." She took a breath, the cold air filling her lungs. "You said you needed someone to keep you warm," she said. "You said you needed a wife." Caleb narrowed his eyes. He did not move. "I do," he said cautiously. Eleanor took a step forward. The mud squelched beneath her expensive leather boots. "Then take me," she said. The silence that stretched between them was heavier than the mountains. Caleb stared at her, thinking he had misunderstood. He looked for the mockery, the punchline, the hidden friends waiting to burst out laughing. "You are making a game of me," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "Like the girl." "I am not my daughter," Eleanor said fiercely. Her hands were clenched at her sides. "I am a widow. Mr. Bracken. I have money. I have a house full of fine furniture. I have a name that opens doors in this territory, and I would trade every single ounce of it to never have to walk through those doors again." She looked him in the eye, stripping away her pride. "I am drowning here," she whispered. "I am slowly turning into stone. I saw you today. I saw a man who survived. I need to survive." Caleb looked at her. He saw the desperation shaking in her hands. He saw the truth in her eyes. It was a different kind of hunger than his, but it was just as sharp. He looked at her hands. They were white, smooth, uncalloused. "The mountains are not a place for a lady," he said. "It is a hard country. There is no comfort, no servants. The cold does not care who your family is." "I do not want comfort," Eleanor replied. "I want a life that is mine." Caleb shook his head. "You do not know what you are asking. It is blood and dirt. You have to kill what you eat. You have to skin it. You have to endure silence that lasts for weeks." Can you endure it? She asked. I was made for it. Then teach me, she said. Caleb studied her. He looked for the weakness he knew must be there. He saw fear, yes. But beneath the fear, he saw a strange, brittle resolve. She was like a piece of iron that had been heated and hammered until it was ready to break or be forged into something new. He needed a wife. He needed help with the work. He needed a presence in the cabin to keep the madness of solitude at bay. He had asked for a girl who was soft and spoiled. Instead, fate had sent him a woman who was broken and desperate. Maybe that was a better bargain. If you come with me, Caleb said, his voice low, I will not treat you like a queen. You will work. You will pull your weight. I am not afraid of work, Eleanor said. And I will not beg you to stay, he added, his tone darkening. If you break, if you want to run back to your silk sheets, I will not stop you. But I will not come down to fetch you. I will not run, she said. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The fiddle music seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of the wind in the eaves of the stable. We leave before sunup, he said. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her shoulders sagged slightly, then squared again. I will be ready. The hours before dawn were the coldest of the night. The town of Bitter Creek lay silent, sleeping off the whiskey and the dancing. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky. Eleanor moved through her house like a thief. She wore her sturdiest dress, a dark wool traveling suit, and a heavy cloak. She carried a single carpet bag. She had left her jewelry in her vanity box. She had left the deed to the house on the dining table. She paused at the door of Clarabelle's room. She could hear her daughter's soft, rhythmic breathing. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden. She was abandoning her child, but Clarabelle was a child no longer, and she was shaped by a world Eleanor could no longer abide. Clarabelle would have the house. She would have the money. She would have suitors. She would be the queen of Bitter Creek. It was what she wanted. Eleanor went to the small writing desk in the hallway. She took a piece of paper and dipped the pen in the inkwell. The scratching of the nib sounded loud in the quiet house. Clarabelle, do not look for me. I have gone to find a life that belongs to me. You have everything you ever wanted here. I leave it all to you. Be kinder than you were yesterday. Mother. She left the note on the hallway table, weighted down by her silver hairbrush. She walked out the front door and closed it softly behind her. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot to her ears. She did not look back. She walked through the sleeping town, her boots crunching on the frozen mud. The air was crisp and hurt her throat. She felt a terror rising in her chest, cold and gripping. She was walking away from safety. She was walking away from everything she knew. She was walking toward a man who was a stranger, a man who carried a knife and smelled of blood. But as she walked, she also felt something else, the tight band that had constricted her chest for 15 years, ever since her husband first raised his hand to her, began to loosen. She reached the edge of town. Caleb was there. He was mounted on his roan, holding the lead rope of the mule. He had saddled a second horse, a sturdy bay gelding he must have traded for during the night. He did not speak as she approached. He reached down a hand. His palm was rough, swallowing hers completely. He pulled her up effortlessly, swinging her into the saddle of the bay. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the gloom. You are sure? He asked. Eleanor looked up at the mountains. They were dark, jagged shadows against the stars. They looked formidable. They looked indifferent, I am sure, she said. Caleb nodded once. He turned his horse toward the north, toward the high passes and the deep timber. Let's ride, he said. They moved out of the town, the hooves of their horses muffled by the frost-hardened earth. Within minutes, the buildings of Bitter Creek were swallowed by the darkness behind them. Ahead lay the wilderness, vast and waiting. Eleanor Harlow tightened her grip on the reins and rode into the wild. For the first day, they rode hard, putting the prairie behind them as the land began to heave itself upward into rugged foothills. The air became thinner and colder with every hour. By noon, the pale autumn sun had vanished behind a ceiling of bruised, gray clouds. By 3 o'clock, a driving, icy rain began to fall. Eleanor had a hood on her cloak, but it was no match for the wind. The cold water found its way down her neck, plastered her dark hair to her scalp, and soaked her wool suit until it weighed as much as chainmail. She was a moderately skilled rider. Having spent years riding side saddle on gentle mares in the town park, this was different. The bay gelding Caleb had given her was a powerful animal, but it stumbled on the rocky, narrow game trails, and she lacked the strength to muscle it back into line. Caleb rode ahead, his shoulders set against the downpour, seemingly indifferent to the weather. He and his roan moved as one creature, navigating the treacherous terrain with an ease that frustrated her. After 5 hours, she could no longer feel her feet. They were numb, encased in her elegant leather boots. She had paid a small fortune for those boots in St. Louis. They were made for stepping from a carriage onto a clean boardwalk. Now, they were caked in mud, the soles splitting, the fine leather saturated and ruined. She began to understand. This was not an adventure. This was not a romantic flight from a life she disdained. This was an exchange. She had traded a soft, warm prison for a hard, cold freedom. She was not sure she would survive it. The rain turned to stinging sleet as darkness fell. Caleb finally stopped in a thick grove of pine trees that offered meager shelter. He dismounted, his movements economical, and began unsaddling the horses without a word. Eleanor tried to dismount. Her legs were frozen, locked in place. She gripped the pommel, her body shaking so violently her teeth rattled. She felt a wave of humiliating despair. She was going to freeze to death. 20 miles from the town she had left, Caleb finished with the mule and came to her side. He looked up at her, his face a mask in the gloom. He did not ask if she needed help. He did not offer any words of comfort. He simply put his large, gloved hands on her waist, gripped her as if she were a sack of flour, and lifted her bodily from the saddle. Her legs buckled when they touched the ground. She would have fallen if he had not been holding her. He steadied her for a moment, then released her. He built a fire with a speed that seemed like a magic trick. He pulled dry kindling from inside his pack and used a flint and steel, shielding the spark from the wind with his own body. Within minutes, a small, smoky flame leaped to life. He gave her a piece of hard jerky and a tin cup of water from his canteen. She chewed the jerky until her jaw ached, the salt and smoke flavor overwhelming. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. He did not sleep near her. He took his bedroll and laid it under a rocky overhang 20 yards away, leaving her with the fire and the horses. She understood. He was giving her privacy, but he was also keeping his distance. She was a liability, and he was waiting to see if she would break. She huddled under her soaked cloak, steam rising from her clothes, and stared into the fire. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for the drawing room. Out here, it seemed like a waste of heat. They traveled for 2 more days. The terrain grew steeper. They crossed a river so cold it took her breath away, the water surging against the horse's legs. She saw a wolf, a gray phantom watching them from a ridge, its eyes yellow and intelligent, before it vanished back into the timber. On the 3rd morning, Eleanor could not get up. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her hands were raw from the reins, her knees and thighs bruised black from gripping the horse. She lay in her bedroll, the sun barely risen, and felt the first true wave of regret. Caleb had the horses saddled and the mule packed. He came over to her. "We move," he said. "I cannot," she whispered. Her voice was a dry croak. "A storm is coming. A real one. We do not get to the cabin. We die." He said it simply, as a fact, like stating the color of the sky. "I am trying," she said, her voice breaking with frustration. I need a minute." He looked at her, his slate eyes unreadable. Then he did something that surprised her. He went to his pack and pulled out his heavy buffalo hide coat. It was stiff, stained, and smelled strongly of him, of smoke, pine, and animal. He threw it at her. "Put that on," he said. "It will stop the wind." He then went to his own horse, the scarred roan. He untied his bedroll from the back of the saddle and tied it onto the mule. Shifting the loads, he came back to Eleanor. He did not offer a hand. He bent down and slipped one arm under her back and one under her knees, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. She was too shocked to protest. He carried her to his roan and set her in his saddle. "This horse is better on the rock," he said. "You will sit here." He swung himself up onto her bay, a horse less familiar with the high country. He took the lead rope for the mule. He did not look at her again. He simply pointed his new mount up the narrow, winding trail and began to walk. He had given her his coat. He had given her his horse. He had not said one kind word. Eleanor wrapped the massive coat around her. The fur was warm against her skin. She was surrounded by his scent. She watched his broad back as he walked ahead of her, and for the first time, she did not feel cold. They reached the cabin late that afternoon. The snow had begun to fall, fat, heavy flakes that muffled the sound of their travel. Eleanor saw it through the swirl of white. It was not a cabin so much as an assertion of will against the wilderness. It was built into the side of a hill, surrounded by a towering stand of lodgepole pine. It was made of massive, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. The roof was sod. A thin curl of old smoke stain rose from a stone chimney. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen. To the side, there was a crude trapping shed made of raw timber and a small corral with a lean-to. Caleb slid off the bay and came to help her down. This time, she managed to move her own legs, sliding stiffly to the ground. Her ruined boots crunched in the new snow. He pushed the heavy plank door open. Inside, it was one room, dark and smelling of cold ashes and cured hides. A stone hearth dominated one wall. On the other wall, a row of traps and snares hung next to strings of dried herbs. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 three-legged stools, and shelves built into the wall holding tins and sacks. And in the corner, there was a bed. One bed. It was a simple frame, built from pine, and covered with a thick pile of bear and wolf furs. Eleanor stared at it. The reality of her decision, the scandalous, irreversible nature of it, hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was here, in the wilderness, with a man she did not know, and there was only one bed. Caleb walked past her. He dropped a load of supplies on the table. He did not seem to notice the tension in the room, or if he did, he ignored it. "The spring is 20 yards north," he said, gesturing to a wooden bucket. "The outhouse is behind the shed. Keep the door barred at night. We get bears." He turned and looked at her. She was still standing by the door, wrapped in his coat, looking small and pale. "You can have the bed," he said, pulling his own bedroll from his pack. "I sleep on the floor." He threw the bedroll near the hearth and began building a fire. The conversation was over. The first few days were a quiet, desperate battle. Eleanor realized she was functionally useless. She, who could host a dinner for 12, who could debate politics and literature, who could play the piano, knew nothing of consequence. She did not know how to make fire. She did not know how to stay warm. She did not know how to feed herself, but she refused to be a burden. She would not go back to Bitter Creek, tail between her legs, to be the subject of pity and scorn. She began to help, or try. She was assigned the wood, the first time. She went out and gathered an armful of small, thin branches from the ground, most of them damp. She brought them in, proud of her contribution. Caleb looked at the pile. He said nothing. He simply took his axe and walked outside. A few minutes later, she heard the ringing thud of the axe, followed by the groan and crash of a large tree. He returned an hour later. Having bucked and split an entire dead pine, he stacked the wood by the hearth. He did not look at her. She took over the cooking. She had watched her cook in Bitter Creek, but she had never held a skillet. Her first attempt at biscuits was a disaster. She mixed the flour and water, but misjudged the heat of the open fire. The biscuits were black on the outside, a raw, gummy paste on the inside. Caleb took one. He bit into it. She watched his jaw work. He swallowed. "Good," he said, his voice flat. He ate the whole thing. She knew he was lying. She saw him later, outside the trapping shed, gnawing on a piece of jerky. That night, she cried into the pillow, but she did it silently, so he would not hear. The next day, she tried to milk the goat. Caleb had a stubborn, mean-eyed nanny goat he kept for milk. Eleanor approached it with the pail. The goat looked at her with utter contempt. Eleanor sat on the small stool and tried to do as she had seen a farm girl do once. The goat kicked the pail, sending it clattering against the cabin wall. Then it butted Eleanor in the hip, knocking her off the stool and into the mud. She sat there, stunned, mud seeping into her wool dress. She heard a sound. It was a low chuckle. Caleb was leaning against the cabin door, watching. It was the first time she had heard him make a sound that was not speech. "You got to hold her horns," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And you got to be meaner than she is." He walked over, grabbed the goat by the horns with one hand, and milked her with the other. The milk streamed into the pail. Eleanor watched, humiliated and furious. But she also watched his hands. They were scared and rough, but they were gentle with the animal. He handed her the pail, half full. "You try tomorrow," he said. They existed in this tense, quiet domesticity for 2 weeks. They barely spoke, but they were acutely aware of each other. She learned the rhythm of his movements. He learned the sound of her breathing in the night. He slept on the floor, a wall of furs between them, but the intimacy of the small space was suffocating. She watched him. She saw the way he moved, with a quiet, powerful grace. She saw that he was meticulous. His traps were clean, his rifle was oiled, his knives were razor-sharp. He was a man who lived on the edge of death, and so he took no chances. He watched her, too. He saw her fail, and get up and try again. He saw her hands, once soft, become red and raw, then begin to blister and callous. He saw her burn the stew, and he saw her set it aside and make a new one, this time getting it right. He watched her go back to the goat, day after day, until the goat finally let her milk it without a fight. He kept his distance, but his admiration was a quiet, cautious thing, growing in the silence. One night, a storm blew in. It was not snow, but a driving, freezing wind that shrieked around the corners of the cabin and rattled the door in its frame. The cabin, which had seemed so solid, now felt like a tiny, fragile shell against the rage of the mountain. Eleanor lay in the bed, under the heavy furs, but she could not sleep. The wind sounded like a woman screaming. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows. Caleb was on his pallet of furs, sleeping, or so she thought. Then she saw him move. He sat up, his back to her, and she heard him hiss in a sharp intake of breath. He was favoring his left shoulder. He stood, thinking she was asleep, and moved to the hearth. The wind must have been driving the cold into his old wounds. He stood in the faint firelight, a silhouette against the orange glow. He unbuttoned his wool shirt. Eleanor watched. He pulled the shirt off, letting it fall to the floor. He turned his back to the fire, raising his arms to let the heat soak into his skin. The firelight washed over his chest and back. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. His body was a map of violence. She saw the puckered, angry scar of a bullet hole just above his collarbone. She saw a series of long, white lines crisscrossing his ribs, the telltale marks of a knife or a saber. But it was his back that held her gaze. From his left shoulder down to his waist, 3 deep, ragged scars ran in parallel lines, as if a giant hand had tried to rip the flesh from his bones. A bear. It had to be a bear. He stood there, absorbing the heat, a picture of broken, powerful masculinity. Eleanor felt an urge so strong it was a physical ache. It was not a desire. It was recognition. She, too, was covered in scars, but hers were on the inside, where no one could see them. Her late husband had left his marks on her soul. She slipped out of the bed. The floor was ice cold beneath her bare feet. Caleb heard the movement. He tensed, grabbing for his shirt, turning. Eleanor growled, alarmed, pulling the shirt up to cover himself. But she was already there. Before he could hide, before he could retreat behind his anger, she reached out, her hand, pale and smooth in the firelight, hovered over his skin. Her fingers, no longer soft, but chapped and raw from work, were trembling. She touched him. She laid her fingertips gently on the edge of the deepest scar on his shoulder. Galeb flinched as if she had branded him. He pulled away, stepping back, his face a mask of anger and surprise. "Some wounds don't close," he said. His voice was rough, a warning to back away. Eleanor did not retreat. She held his gaze, her hand still raised in the air between them. The wind howled outside, filling the silence. "That doesn't mean they don't deserve warmth," she replied. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the noise of the storm. They stood frozen. He was half naked, his vulnerabilities exposed. She was in her thin nightgown, her own defenses down. The air in the cabin was thick, charged with the words. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a fine lady, but a woman as scarred as he was. The moment stretched, heavy and breakable. Then Caleb turned. He picked up his shirt, put it on, and buttoned it slowly, never taking his eyes off her. Eleanor lowered her hand. She turned and walked back to the bed, climbing under the heavy furs, her heart hammering against her ribs. Caleb did not go back to his bedroll. He sat on the stool by the fire, his back to her, and stared into the flames. He did not move until the first gray light of dawn. The snow began on a Tuesday, a low, gray, heavy sky that seemed to press down on the rooftops of the world, and by Friday, the cabin was buried. It was not the polite, decorative dusting Eleanor had known in the town square of Bitter Creek. This was a siege. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at the shingles and piling drifts 10 feet high against the north wall. The windows became opaque squares of white, blocking out the sun and reducing their world to the single, flickering room lit by the hearth and the tallow candles. They were trapped. For the first week, the confinement was a test of patience. Caleb occupied himself with oiling his traps and mending leather harness straps, his large hands moving with a dexterity that always mesmerized her. Eleanor read the single Bible they had, cover to cover, until the words blurred. They moved around each other like ghosts in a bottle, careful not to touch, careful not to speak too loudly, the memory of that night by the fire hanging between them like a suspended blade. Then the fever took her. It started as a scratching in her throat, a dry irritation she blamed on the smoke from the hearth. But within hours, it had bloomed into a raging heat that seemed to boil the marrow in her bones. She collapsed near the woodpile, her legs simply refusing to hold her weight. Caleb caught her before she hit the floor, his arms hard and unyielding, and carried her to the bed. For the next 4 days, Eleanor Harlow ceased to exist in the present. She drifted on a dark tide of delirium, tossing and turning beneath the mountain of furs. Her body alternated between violent, teeth-chattering chills and sweats that soaked her nightgown until it clung to her like a second skin. Caleb did not sleep. He pulled the stool to the side of the bed and sat there, a silent sentinel against the dark. He fed her water from a spoon, drop by drop, patiently waiting when she coughed it back up. He bathed her forehead with snow. He melted in a basin, his rough, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they brushed the damp hair from her face. In the grip of the fever, the walls of the cabin dissolved. Eleanor was no longer in the mountains. She was back in the parlor of her grand house in Bitter Creek. She was back in the suffocating velvet prison of her marriage. She began to talk. Her voice was high and thin, terrified. "Please, Arthur," she whimpered, shrinking back into the pillows, shielding her face with her hands. "Not the face. We have the mayor's dinner tomorrow. Please note the face." Caleb stiffened. He sat frozen on the stool, the wet rag dripping in his hand. He watched the woman writhe, fighting off a ghost. "He is such a good man," Eleanor whispered, her voice shifting to a frantic, social pitch, mimicking the tone she used for the town gossip. "Everyone says so. Look at the library he built. Look at how he shakes hands. He is a saint." She laughed then, a dry, brittle sound that turned into a sob. "A saint who breaks fingers. Does the town know? Arthur, does the town know you like the sound it makes?" She thrashed, kicking the furs off. Caleb leaned forward and gently pulled the heavy bear hide back over her. She flinched violently at his touch, her eyes wide and unseeing, filled with a terror that cut him to the bone. "I am sorry," she begged, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. "I will smile. I promise. I will smile and pour the tea, and no one will know. Just stop. Please stop." Caleb Bracken had seen men die. He had seen bodies stacked like cordwood at Shiloh. He had seen starvation and freezing death in the high passes. But he had never felt a rage like the one that rose in his chest now. It was a cold, black fury directed at a dead man. A man who had taken this woman's spirit and twisted it until she apologized for her own pain. He reached out and took her hand. She tried to pull away, but he held fast, anchoring her to the reality of the cabin, to the smell of pine and smoke. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and rumbling, cutting through her hallucinations. She looked at him, blinking. The panic in her eyes wavered. "He is not here," Caleb said. "He is dead. You are in the mountains." She stared at him, her chest heaving. "You do not have to smile anymore," he whispered. The words hung in the air. Eleanor's eyes searched his face, finding the scar on his cheek, the gray in his beard, the slate-colored eyes that held no cruelty, only a deep, sorrowful recognition. "You do not have to smile," he repeated. Her breathing slowed. The tension that had held her body rigid for days seemed to snap. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the fever struck, she fell into a true, restful sleep. When she woke, the storm had passed. The silence in the cabin was absolute. She felt weak, hollowed out, as if the fever had burned away everything unnecessary. She turned her head. Caleb was sitting by the hearth, the firelight playing over his features. He was whittling something, his knife moving in small, precise strokes. "Water," she croaked. He was at her side in an instant. He supported her head as she drank deeply from the tin cup. The water was cold and tasted of melted snow. It was the sweetest thing she had ever known. "You stayed," she said softly. "I live here," he replied, his voice gruff, retreating to his usual defense. "You stayed awake," she corrected. He did not deny it. He set the cup down and reached into his pocket. He pulled out the object he had been carving. It was a comb. It was made of smooth, pale birch wood. It was not the tortoiseshell or silver she was used to, but it was beautiful. The spine of the comb was carved with the delicate likeness of a fern frond. "Your hair was tangled," he said, looking at the floor. Eleanor took the comb. Her fingers brushed his. The wood was warm from his hand. She looked at the object, realizing the hours of care it represented. In a world where survival was the only currency, he had spent time making something for her vanity, for her dignity. "Thank you," she whispered. She tried to sit up to run the comb through her matted hair, but her arms were too weak. "Let me," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed. It was a breach of the boundary they had maintained for weeks, but neither of them pulled away. He took the comb and began to work it through her long, dark hair. He was incredibly gentle, starting at the ends and working his way up, teasing out the knots without pulling. The rhythmic sensation of the comb, the heat of his body near hers, the memory of his voice in the dark telling her she did not have to smile. It was too much. The dam that Eleanor had built around her heart, the wall of propriety and fear, finally crumbled. She turned her head. He paused, his hand still in her hair. They looked at each other. The air in the cabin grew heavy, charged with the static of two lonely, wounded animals recognizing a mate. "Caleb," she breathed. He leaned in. The movement was hesitant, trembling, as if he expected her to shatter. He was a man who knew how to kill, how to trap, how to survive, but he did not know how to be tender without fear. Their lips met. It was not a graceful kiss. It was clumsy. Their noses bumped. Caleb's beard scratched her chin, but then Eleanor made a sound, a small noise of need, and she reached up, tangling her fingers in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming desperate. It was a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was the starving need for contact, for proof of life. Caleb groaned, a low sound in his throat, and his arms went around her, pulling her flush against him. The comb clattered to the floor. They moved together with a frantic energy. There was no seduction, no coyness. It was a collision. Caleb stripped the heavy furs away, his hands roaming over her body, reverent and possessive. Eleanor, weak as she was, met him with a fierceness that surprised them both. She tore at the buttons of his shirt, needing to feel the skin she had only seen in the firelight. When they finally came together, it was emotional and raw. It was not the polite, dutiful act she had endured with her husband. This was earth and fire. It was Caleb's heavy weight pressing her into the mattress, grounding her. It was Eleanor arching to meet him, claiming him, taking the warmth he had offered and returning it tenfold. There were tears, though neither knew who was crying. There was the scent of pine and sweat and the musk of the furs. And when the release came, it was a shattering thing that left them both gasping, clinging to each other as if the world outside had fallen away into the white void. Afterward, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the silence of strangers, but the stunned, heavy silence of a landscape after an earthquake. Caleb rolled onto his back, staring up at the dark beams of the ceiling. Eleanor lay curled against his side, her head resting on the scar on his shoulder. They did not speak. There were no words for what had shifted. The intimacy was overwhelming, terrified and beautiful all at once. They fell asleep like that, limbs tangled, the fire popping softly in the grate. 2 weeks later, the peace was shattered. It was a deep night, the moon casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Eleanor woke to a sound that curdled her blood, the high, human-like shriek of a goat in mortal terror. Caleb was out of bed before the sound had finished echoing. He was naked, but he grabbed his rifle from the wall and the heavy skinning knife from the table without breaking stride. He kicked the door open, the freezing air rushing in like a physical blow. "Stay inside," he roared, plunging into the snow. Eleanor scrambled up, wrapping a blanket around herself, her heart hammering. She heard the snarling of a beast, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated in the floorboards. Then the crack of the rifle, sharp and loud. Then silence. Then a second shot. Eleanor could not wait. She grabbed the lantern, lit it with shaking hands, and ran out into the snow. Her bare feet burned on the ice, but she did not feel it. Caleb was by the corral. The snow was splattered with bright, arterial red. One of the goats lay dead, its throat torn out. Standing over it was Caleb, breathing hard, steam rising from his bare skin in the frigid air. At his feet lay a mountain lion, a massive, tawny female, gaunt with winter hunger. Caleb turned when he saw the light. He was covered in blood. "I told you to stay inside," he growled, but his voice lacked its usual force. He swayed slightly. Eleanor rushed to him. It was not just the cougar's blood. 3 deep, parallel gashes ran down his right arm, from the deltoid to the elbow, weeping dark blood onto the snow. The cat had clawed him before he put the second bullet in its brain. "You're hurt," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. He looked at his arm as if surprised it belonged to him. "It is nothing, just a scratch." "It is not a scratch," she said firmly. "Inside, now." She guided him back into the cabin. The roles had reversed. The invalid was now the nurse. She sat him on the stool near the fire and threw more logs on the grate until the flames roared. She boiled water. She found his sewing kit, the heavy needle and the silk thread he used for repairing buckskins. "This will hurt," she said, pouring whiskey over the open wound. Caleb hissed through his teeth, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. "Do it!" Eleanor began to stitch. Her hands, which had once embroidered silk handkerchiefs, were now sewing human flesh. She worked quickly, efficiently, pulling the edges of the wound together. Caleb watched her. He watched the concentration on her face, the way she bit her lip. The pain was sharp, but it grounded him. "Why?" he asked suddenly. Eleanor tied off a knot and snipped the thread. "Why what? Why did you come here?" Truly, it was not just the girl laughing. Eleanor paused. She dipped a rag in water and began wiping the dried blood from his arm. "Because I was dead," she said simply. "I was walking around, breathing, drinking tea. But I was dead. I looked at you, and you looked alive. You looked like you were fighting for something. I wanted to fight." Caleb looked into the fire. "I fought," he said. "The war." He had never spoken of it. Eleanor stopped wiping his arm and waited. "I was 20, he said. "Tennessee. My family. They were poor dirt farmers. My father ran off when I was 10. My mother died of a fever. It was just me and my brother, Samuel. We joined up because they promised us boots and food." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "There were no boots, and there was no food. Samuel, he was younger, softer. We got captured near Vicksburg. They put us in a camp. It was just mud and dysentery. We were starving, truly starving. The kind where you look at a rat and see a feast." Eleanor took his hand, holding it between hers. Samuel became sick. Caleb continued, his voice flat, detached. "I gave him my rations. It wasn't much, a hardtack biscuit, some watery soup. But he couldn't keep it down. He wasted away. I watched him transform into a skeleton. I held him when he died. He weighed less than a child." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes wet. "I came west because there were too many people back east. Too many ghosts. I wanted a place where the only thing trying to kill me was the cold or a bear. Something honest." He looked down at his stitched arm. "You are the first person," he said quietly. "The first person since Samuel who has touched me without pity." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat the size of a stone. She understood then. Pity was what the townspeople had given her. Poor Eleanor. Poor widow. Pity was a way of looking down on someone, of separating yourself from their pain. She leaned forward and kissed his forehead, then his cheek, then his lips. "I do not pity you, Caleb," she whispered. "I admire you." He looked at her, and the walls he had built for 20 years, the walls of silence and solitude, cracked wide open. He buried his face in her neck, and she held him while the wind howled outside. Two survivors clinging to the wreckage of their pasts, building something new from the pieces. The next morning, Caleb went out to deal with the carcass of the cougar and the dead goat. The work had to be done. Eleanor remained inside. She felt a strange, vibrating energy in her chest. She needed to do something with it. She needed to mark this change. She went to the bottom of her carpet bag. Hidden beneath the layers of wool and linen, there was a heavy, leather-bound ledger. She had stolen it from her husband's study the night she left. It was meant for recording debts and assets. She opened it to the first blank page. She took a small bottle of ink and a steel-nibbed pen. She sat at the rough table, the morning light spilling onto the paper. She looked at her hands, stained with ink, scarred from work, strong. She began to write. December 12th, 1882. "I am not a ghost. I am not a widow in silk. I am a woman who stitches flesh and milks goats, and loves a man who smells of pine and blood. The wind is screaming outside, but for the first time in my life, I am not cold. I bleed. I burn. I live." She wrote until the ink ran dry, pouring her soul into the pages, claiming her story, one word at a time. When Caleb returned, stamping the snow from his boots, she did not hide the book. She looked up at him and smiled, not the polite, frozen smile of Mrs. Harlow, but the tired, genuine smile of Eleanor Bracken. And for the first time, he smiled back. Spring arrived in the high country not with a whisper, but with a roar. The silence of the deep winter was shattered by the sound of water. It dripped from the eaves of the cabin, gurgled in the hidden veins of the earth, and thundered in the creek that had been a silent ribbon of ice for 5 months. The sun, previously a pale and distant coin, grew heavy and gold, burning the snow off the south-facing slopes until the brown earth emerged, steaming and rich with the scent of pine needles and decay. Eleanor Bracken emerged with the land. The woman who had ridden out of Bitter Creek in a velvet riding habit was gone. In her place stood a creature of the mountains. Her skin, once the translucent white of fine porcelain, was now burnished to a deep, healthy bronze by the wind and the glare of the snow. Her hands were no longer smooth. They were map-makers of her daily labor. Calloused across the palms, the fingernails cut short and functional, stained with the resin of firewood and the blood of game. She wore a dress she had sewn herself from calico trade cloth, hemmed high to keep it out of the mud, and over it, she wore a vest made from the hide of the very deer she had helped Caleb skin. She looked wild, and she looked magnificent. The work was endless. The winter had been about survival, about huddling near the fire and counting the sticks of wood. Spring was about industry. The roof of the cabin had taken a beating from the heavy snowpack, and the sod was sagging dangerously over the sleeping loft. Caleb stood on the ground, stripping the bark from a fresh lodgepole pine log. He looked up to see Eleanor perched precariously on the edge of the roof, a hammer in her hand. "Watch your footing," he called out. "The mud is slick." Eleanor did not look down. She drove a nail into the replacement slat with 2 clean, hard strikes. "I am fine," she shouted back. "Throw me the tar bucket." Caleb paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with his forearm. He watched her movement. There was a confidence in her now that had not been there in December. She moved with a center of gravity that was low and sure. He remembered the woman who had been afraid to milk a goat. Now, she was commanding him to toss heavy buckets. He felt a swell of pride in his chest so large it almost hurt. He hefted the bucket of pine tar and swung it up to her. She caught it with one hand, her muscles cording under the thin fabric of her sleeve. They worked side by side for the rest of the day, repairing the damage the winter had wrought. They barely spoke. They did not need to. They had developed a language of movement and breath. When Caleb reached for a plank, Eleanor was already there to steady the other end. When Eleanor stopped to wipe the hair from her eyes, Caleb was there with a dipper of water from the creek. It was a rhythm of shared survival, a dance of 2 people who knew that their lives depended on the other's competence. Later that week, Caleb took her to the high meadow to teach her the rifle. It was a heavy Sharps carbine, a weapon that kicked like a mule. "Hold it tight to the shoulder," Caleb instructed, standing behind her, his chest pressed against her back. "If you leave a gap, it will bruise you." "I am not afraid of a bruise," Eleanor said. She sighted down the barrel at the dead stump 50 yards away. She exhaled, a slow, steady breath, just as he had taught her. Her fingers squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, the sound echoing off the granite peaks like thunder. Smoke obscured the view for a moment. When it cleared, the stump was shattered. Caleb lowered the rifle barrel gently. "Good shot." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes bright with adrenaline. "It feels powerful," she said. "It is a tool," Caleb corrected her, though his eyes were warm. "It fills the pot. It stops the wolves." He took the rifle from her and reloaded it. But the way he handed it back, stock first, was an act of immense trust. He was arming her. He was making her dangerous. In the world he came from, you only armed the people you would die for. 3,000 feet below, in the mud-clogged streets of Bitter Creek, the spring thaw had brought a different kind of heat. Clarabelle Harlow walked out of the millinery shop, her face burning. The whispers had started the moment she entered. 2 women near the ribbon counter had fallen silent, their eyes darting to her and then away, barely suppressing their titters. "Did you hear?" one had whispered, loud enough to be heard. "They say she is living like a squaw, wearing skins, cooking over a dirt fire, with that beast of a man." The other replied, "Imagine, Eleanor Harlow, a trapper's woman. It is a sickness, surely." Clarabelle had dropped the spool of lace she was holding and fled the shop. She stood on the boardwalk, her hands trembling in her kidskin gloves. The shame was a physical weight, dragging her shoulders down. For months, she had told everyone her mother had gone east to visit relatives in Boston. She had lied to the pastor. She had lied to her suitors. But the truth had leaked out, as it always did in a frontier town. A fur trader had seen them. A prospector had passed the cabin. The gossip was spreading like wildfire, painting her mother not just as a runaway, but as a fallen woman. a creature of base instincts who had traded civilization for lust. Clarabelle felt the anger rise in her throat, hot and acidic. How could she? How could her mother destroy their reputation for a man who looked like a bear and smelled of grease? It was selfish. It was madness. "I'm going to get her," Clarabelle said to the empty air. She marched to the livery stable. She demanded a horse, ignoring the stablemaster's warning about the weather turning. She was 19 years old, fueled by indignation and the arrogance of the righteous. She packed a small bag with a fresh dress for her mother, convinced that once Eleanor saw reason, once she was reminded of who she was, she would come home. Clarabelle rode out of town an hour later. She followed the vague directions the prospector had muttered in the saloon. Up the North Fork, past the split rock, into the deep timber. She rode hard, her anger sustaining her for the first 10 miles. But the mountains did not care about her anger. As she climbed, the spring sunshine vanished. The sky turned a bruised, sullen purple. The wind picked up, screaming through the canyons, carrying the scent of ozone and ice. A spring storm in the Rockies was often more deadly than a winter blizzard. It came fast, wet, and heavy. The rain started as a cold mist, then turned to sleet that stung her face like buckshot. The temperature plummeted. Clarabelle's velvet riding cloak was soaked through in minutes. She shivered, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. The trail, which had been muddy before, turned into a soup of slick clay. Her horse, a nervous mare from the flatlands, began to toss its head and sidestep. "Go on, you stupid beast!" Clarabelle shrieked, kicking the horse's flanks. The mare panicked. It scrambled for footing on a slate rock, slipped, and went down. Clarabelle was thrown clear, landing hard in a patch of thorny brush. She screamed as the thorns tore at her face and hands. The mare scrambled up, eyes rolling white with terror, and bolted back down the trail. Disappearing into the gray curtain of sleet, Clarabelle lay in the mud. Her leg throbbed. She tried to stand, but the cold had already seeped into her muscles. She was alone. The silence of the woods was terrifying, broken only by the hiss of the sleet and the roar of the wind. She began to walk, limping heavily. She called out for her mother, but the wind swallowed her voice. She walked for what felt like hours, but was likely only one. The cold was narcotic. It made her sleepy. It made her want to lie down in the soft, wet moss and close her eyes. Just for a moment. She thought, "I will just rest for a moment." She curled up at the base of a massive spruce tree. The world went gray, then black. The dog sensed it first. Caleb kept 2 hounds now, wiry mountain curls that guarded the livestock. They began to bark, low and agitated, facing down the valley. Caleb looked up from the woodpile. He smelled the storm in the air, but he also felt a prickle on the back of his neck. "Someone is coming," he said. Eleanor came to the door, wiping flour from her hands. Who would come in this weather? Caleb grabbed his coat and his rifle. "I don't know, but the dogs don't lie." He saddled the roan quickly. Eleanor grabbed her cloak and swung up onto the bay. They rode down the trail, the dogs leading the way, their noses close to the ground. They found her a mile from the cabin. She was a small, dark heap against the base of a tree, half buried in the accumulating slush. "Clarabelle!" Eleanor screamed. She threw herself off the horse before it had fully stopped. She hit the ground running, sliding in the mud, falling to her knees beside her daughter. Clarabelle was blue. Her skin was waxy, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her fine riding habit was torn and sodden. Eleanor gathered the girl into her arms. "Clarabelle, wake up, look at me." Caleb was there a second later. He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the girl. He touched her neck, checking for a pulse. "She is alive," he said, his voice tight, but barely. "The cold has gone deep." He lifted Clarabelle effortlessly, passing her up to Eleanor, who had remounted the bay. "Hold her close," Caleb ordered. "Share your heat. We have to get her to the fire." The ride back was a blur of fear. Eleanor held her daughter against her chest, rocking her, whispering into her frozen ear. She felt the terrifying stillness of the girl's body. Inside the cabin, The heat hit them like a physical wall. Caleb built the fire up until it roared like a blast furnace. They stripped the wet clothes off Clarabelle and wrapped her in warm wool blankets and furs. Eleanor rubbed her daughter's hands and feet, trying to coax the blood back into the extremities. It took an hour for Clarabelle to groan. Her eyelids fluttered. She let out a low moan of pain as the feeling began to return to her frozen limbs. "Mother," she whispered. "I am here," Eleanor said, brushing the damp hair from the girl's forehead. "You are safe." Clarabelle's eyes focused. She looked around the room. She saw the rough log walls. She saw the pelts hanging from the rafters. She saw the dirt floor, packed hard and swept clean. And she saw Caleb, standing by the door, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. The memory of the town, the gossip, the shame, came rushing back, overriding the cold. She looked at her mother. She saw the calluses on Eleanor's hands. She saw the simple calico dress. She saw the streaks of gray in Eleanor's hair that were no longer hidden by dye or pins. "You!" Clarabelle spat, her voice cracking. "Clarabelle, lie down," Eleanor said gently. "You are weak." Clarabelle shoved her mother's hand away. She scrambled back against the wall, her eyes wild. "Look at you," she hissed. "Look at this place. It is a hovel. It smells of beast and blood. It is warm," Eleanor said calmly. "It is a sty," Clarabelle shouted, finding her strength in her fury. "You left a mansion for this? You left silk sheets for mud and this brute?" She pointed a trembling finger at Caleb. Caleb did not move. He did not speak. He merely watched, his face impassive. Eleanor stood up. She did not shout back. She did not shrink away. She stood tall, her spine straight, her presence filling the small room. "I did not leave for mud," Eleanor said. Her voice was low, but it held a steel that Clarabelle had never heard before. "Then why?" Clarabelle cried, tears of frustration spilling down her cheeks. "Why would you humiliate us? Why would you ruin everything?" "Because I was dying," Eleanor said. Clarabelle blinked. "You were not dying. You were healthy. You had everything. I had things," Eleanor corrected. "I had furniture. I had dresses. I had a name. But I was suffocating. I was a doll in a box. Clarabelle, a doll your father liked to break when he was angry and put back on the shelf when he was done." Clarabelle went still. She knew, deep down. She had heard the shouting through the walls as a child. She had seen the bruises her mother explained away as clumsiness. But she had chosen to ignore it. Ignoring it was the price of the silk sheets. "I found peace here," Eleanor said. She looked around the cabin, not with shame, but with love. "I wake up in the morning and I know who I am. I work until my body aches. But my spirit is light." She looked at her daughter. "I found something you have never known. Clarabelle, I found out that I am strong." Clarabelle slumped back against the logs. The anger drained out of her, leaving her empty and confused. She looked at Caleb again. He was pouring coffee into a tin cup. He brought it over to her. "Drink," he said gently. "It has sugar." She took the cup. His hands were huge, scarred, and terrifying, but he held the cup with a delicacy that baffled her. He did not look at her with the hunger or the calculation she saw in the men back in town. He looked at her with a simple, human concern. Clarabelle stayed for a week. The storm had washed out the lower trail, making travel impossible. She was a prisoner in the cabin, forced to witness the life she had come to destroy. She expected misery. She expected to see her mother cowering, working like a slave for a tyrant. Instead, she saw a partnership. She sat in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, and watched. She watched Caleb sharpen Eleanor's skinning knife, testing the edge on his own thumb to ensure it was perfect for her. She watched Eleanor mend Caleb's shirt while he read aloud to her from the Bible, his voice stumbling over the big words. Eleanor gently correcting him without a hint of condescension. She saw the way they moved around each other in the small kitchen, a touch on the elbow, a glance across the room, a shared smile when the stew was particularly good. It was not the courtly, performative romance she read about in novels, There were no flowers. There were no poetic declarations. It was quiet. It was functional. It was deeply, unsettlingly intimate. One evening, Caleb came in from the trapping line. He was cold, his beard frosted with ice. Eleanor went to him immediately. She helped him out of his heavy coat. She took his frozen hands in hers and rubbed them briskly. "You stayed out too long." She scolded him softly. "The beaver was running," he said, smiling down at her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. It was a piece of river quartz, polished by the water until it glowed milky white. "Found this in the creek," he said. "Thought you might like it." Eleanor took the stone. She looked at it as if it were a diamond. "Thank you," she said. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek. Caleb's hand came up to rest on the small of her back, steadying her, holding her. Clarabelle turned away, feeling like an intruder. She had seen her father give her mother a diamond necklace once, after he had given her a black eye. The necklace had cost thousands, but he had thrown it at her across the table. This stone cost nothing, but the way it was given made the air in the room vibrate. The realization began to creep into Clarabelle's heart, uninvited and uncomfortable. Her mother was happy, truly, deeply happy. On the final night before Clarabelle was to leave, the weather turned mild. The moon was full, bathing the valley in a silver light. Clarabelle woke up in the loft. She heard the door of the cabin creak open, then close. She waited, listening. She heard nothing. Curiosity, or perhaps a need to understand the mystery of this place, drove her from her bed. She climbed down the ladder and went to the window. The cabin was empty. She grabbed her cloak and slipped outside. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new growth. She heard the sound of splashing from the creek that ran behind the cabin. She walked toward the sound, staying in the shadows of the pines. She stopped at the edge of the bank, hidden by a cluster of willows. Caleb and Eleanor were in the water. It was a pool created by a beaver dam, deep and still. The water must have been freezing, fed by the snowmelt, but they did not seem to care. They were naked. Clarabelle's first instinct was to turn away, to shield her eyes from the impropriety, but she was frozen by the sheer, raw beauty of the scene. The moonlight turned their skin to silver. Caleb stood waist-deep, his massive back to Clarabelle, the scars on his shoulders visible even in the dim light. Eleanor was in his arms. Her legs were wrapped around his waist, her arms around his neck. They were not moving frantically. They were simply holding each other. Caleb's forehead rested against Eleanor's. They were swaying slightly with the current of the water. Clarabelle saw her mother throw her head back and laugh, a low, throaty sound of pure joy that rose up into the night sky. Caleb said something that Clarabelle could not hear, and he raised Eleanor higher, burying his face in her chest. It was passionate, yes, but more than that, it was real. It was two people stripping away everything, clothes, pretense, society, and clinging to each other in the vast, indifferent wilderness. It was a claim of life against the dark. Clarabelle felt tears prick her eyes. She realized, with a sudden, crushing clarity, that she had never been loved. Not like this. The boys in town wanted her waist, or her father's money, or her pretty face. None of them would stand in freezing water just to hold her. She looked at the lovers one last time. Her mother looked like a queen. Not a queen of silk and parlors, but a queen of the river and the night. Clarabelle turned away, stepping softly on the pine needles so as not to disturb them. She walked back to the cabin, her world tilted on its axis. She lay down in the dark, listening to the wind, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel superior to her mother. She felt envious, and she felt awe. The beaver pelts were prime. Caleb had spent the late winter and early spring working the high country creeks, and the harvest was thick, the fur glossy and heavy. He baled them into tight bundles, ready for the trading post. They were running low on salt, on coffee, and on lead for casting bullets. The garden, which Eleanor had attacked with a religious fervor, needed new seed. It was time. Eleanor watched him load the pack mule. It was the first week of June. The valley was alive, buzzing with the sound of insects and the rush of the creek. She felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach, a cold stone in the midst of the summer warmth. "You will be careful," she said. It was not a question. Caleb finished tightening a strap and turned to her. He looked at her, his slate eyes soft in the morning light. He saw the woman who had survived the winter, the woman who had stitched his arm and learned to fire his rifle. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. His hands were rough, but his touch was no longer hesitant. It was possessive. It was gentle. "I am just going for salt." "Eleanor," he said, "it is not the mountain I worry about," she whispered. "It is the town." He knew. Bitter Creek was a wound that had never properly healed. He had humiliated the town's golden daughter. Then he had stolen her mother, the town's most respected widow. They would not have forgotten. "I will be back in 2 days," he said. He kissed her. It was a long, deep kiss, not of passion, but of promise. It tasted like coffee and wood smoke. He swung himself up onto the roan, took the mule's lead rope, and rode down the trail without looking back. The town of Bitter Creek was louder and more crowded than he remembered. The spring thaw had brought a fresh rush of prospectors and merchants. He kept his hat low, ignoring the stares as he rode down the main street. He saw the mercantile, the place where it had all begun. He saw Clarabelle's house, the curtains drawn. He tied the mule to the hitching rail outside the trading post at the far end of town, a rougher establishment that dealt mostly with trappers and soldiers from the nearby fort. He did his business quickly. He bartered the pelts for a good price, getting coins in addition to his supplies. He stacked the sacks of flour, salt, and beans. He bought a small bag of peppermint candy, a ridiculous, civilized indulgence that he knew Eleanor would love. He was loading the last sack onto the mule when a voice cut through the street noise. "Mr. Bracken." Caleb did not turn. He kept his hand on the rope, his senses screaming. The voice was smooth, educated, and cold as a snake. "I must admit, I'm surprised to see you," the voice continued. "I had assumed you would be astute enough to remain in your wilderness." Caleb turned slowly. The man was everything Caleb was not. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored black suit, his face clean-shaven, his hair slicked back with macassar oil. He wore a string tie and carried a polished cane. This was Josiah Finch, the executor of Arthur Harlow's estate and the managing partner of his shipping interests. "I have no business with you," Caleb said. His voice was low, a rumble. "I am afraid you do." "Mr. Finch said, taking a small step closer. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "You see, Mr. Bracken, you are in possession of something that does not belong to you." Caleb's hand, which had been on the mule's pack, dropped to his side. "A lady like Mrs. Harlow." "Mr. Finch went on, his voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. "She is a woman of refinement. She is an asset to the community. Her late husband, a man I respected deeply, left her well provided for. The estate is, however, still in probate. Certain assets are not to be moved." He tapped his cane on the boardwalk. "A woman like that," he sighed, "she is delicate. She is not made for this." He gestured vaguely at Caleb's buckskins. "She is property of the estate, in a manner of speaking, until her affairs are settled." Caleb's entire world narrowed to the space between him and this man. He could smell the oil on the man's hair. He could see the small, satisfied glint in his eyes. "You will not speak her name," Caleb said. "Mr." Finch chuckled. A low, condescending sound. "My dear man, I am not speaking of the woman. I am speaking of inheritance. She cannot simply vanish. It is a legal matter. I have come all the way from Helena to settle it. I am empowered to reclaim all assets belonging to the Harlow estate, and I intend to take her back." He took another step. He looked at Caleb as if he were a particularly large, stupid dog that needed to be put down. "Now, you will tell me where she is, and I will ensure the sheriff does not press charges for her." "Abduction," He made the fatal mistake of lifting his cane and pressing the silver tip against Caleb's chest. It happened faster than a snake strike. Caleb's hand shot out and clamped around Mr. Finch's throat. He lifted the man off his feet, his fingers digging into the starched collar. Mr. Finch's eyes bulged. His cane clattered to the boardwalk. He clawed at Caleb's wrist, his face turning a dark, mottled red. Caleb did not throw him. He held him, choking the life from him, and leaned in close. "You do not touch me," he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "And you do not talk about her. She is not property. She is my wife." He slammed Mr. Finch against the wall of the trading post, the impact rattling the windows. Then he drew back his right fist. It was a fist built for splitting logs. He drove it into Mr. Finch's soft, civilized stomach. The man let out a strangled gasp. Caleb let him drop. Mr. Finch crumpled to his knees, coughing and retching. Before he could recover, Caleb grabbed a fistful of his oily hair, yanked his head up, and hit him in the face. The sound of his knuckles connecting with the man's nose was a wet, cracking sound. Blood exploded. Caleb hit him again, and again. He did not stop. This was for the humiliation in the store. This was for the 18 years of bruises on Eleanor's soul. This was for the word property. He stopped only when he heard a scream. The store owner was standing in the doorway, his face pale with terror. Caleb stood up. He was breathing hard. He looked down at Josiah Finch, who was now a bloody, unconscious heap on the boardwalk. Caleb wiped his bleeding knuckles on his buckskins. He looked at the store owner. "He is not to come near my mountain," Caleb said. He untied his roan, grabbed the mule's lead, and rode out of town. He did not run. He rode at a steady walk, a king departing a battlefield. By nightfall, the gossip in Bitter Creek was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. "The beast has stolen her!" He beat Mr. Finch half to death in the street, in broad daylight. Josiah Finch was a gentleman. He was here to save her. The mountain man, the savage. He's bewitched her. He has her tied up in that cabin, a prisoner. The town's shame and fear, simmering since Eleanor had left, found its focus. It was easier to believe Eleanor was a victim than to believe she had chosen a life they all secretly feared. Deacon Price, a man whose piety was exceeded only by his self-importance, stood on a whiskey barrel in the middle of the saloon. He had respected Arthur Harlow, who had donated the stained glass window for the church. "This cannot stand," the deacon shouted, his face red. "We are a civilized people. We cannot allow a brute to hold one of our finest ladies captive. We cannot allow a gentleman to be beaten in our streets without justice." The sheriff, a man who preferred paperwork to gunfire, tried to intervene. "Now, Deacon, we should wait for the circuit judge." "Wait!" the crowd roared. "We rode!" a man shouted from the back. "We ride and get her!" "And we bring that animal back in chains." A posse formed. It was not a legal posse. It was a mob of 15 men, fueled by whiskey and self-righteousness. They were bankers, merchants, and ranch hands, all united in their outrage. "We ride at dawn," Deacon Price declared, holding his Bible aloft. "We ride to rescue the widow Harlow." Clarabelle Harlow heard the noise from her house. She had spent the week since her return from the mountain in a daze. The world she had known, a world of status and silk, now seemed thin and fragile. She had gone to the mercantile to buy thread, her face hidden by a veil, when she heard two women talking. "Beat him so badly. He may lose an eye." "Deacon Price is gathering the men." Clarabelle's blood went cold. She hurried down the street, keeping to the shadows. She stood across from the saloon and listened. She heard the deacon's speech. She heard the shouts. "We ride at dawn." She ran. She did not go to the livery. She ran to her own stable, where her father's fastest horse, a black gelding, was kept. She did not saddle it. She threw a blanket on its back, grabbed a fistful of mane, and hauled herself up. She rode out of the back alley, bareback, her skirts flying. She rode for her mother. She rode for the man who had given her coffee. She rode all night, the black horse eating the trail. She was a better rider now, her time in the mountains having burned away her fear. She pushed the horse until its sides were heaving, until foam flew from its bit. She reached the foothills as the first gray light touched the eastern sky. She saw the smoke from the cabin, a thin, peaceful curl against the dawn. She burst into the clearing, the horse stumbling to a halt. "Mother!" she screamed, sliding from the horse's back. "Mother! They are coming!" The cabin door flew open. Eleanor stood there, a coffee pot in her hand, her hair loose down her back. Caleb was right behind her, his shirt unbuttoned. "They are coming!" Clarabelle gasped, her chest heaving. "A posse. Deacon Price. 15 men. They think you are a prisoner. They are coming to take you back. They are going to hang him." The silence in the clearing was absolute. Caleb moved first. He turned and grabbed his rifle from the wall. He grabbed a box of shells. He pulled a large pack from under the bed and began stuffing it with jerky and ammunition. "We go," he said, his voice flat and hard. Eleanor looked at him. "We go higher," Caleb said, not looking at her. "Into the deep timber. They will never follow us past the granite ridges. They do not know the high passes." Eleanor put the coffee pot down. "Clarabelle, get water in the canteens," she said. Clarabelle ran to obey. Caleb was loading his rifle. "We can be gone in 5 minutes. No, Caleb." He stopped. He turned to her slowly. "Eleanor, you heard the girl. 15 men, with rifles. This is not a fight. It is a slaughter. We run." Eleanor walked over to him. She placed her hand on his chest, over the frantic beating of his heart. "I have been running my entire life," she said. "I ran from my father's house into a marriage I thought was a rescue. I ran from Arthur's fists by smiling at socials. I ran from Bitter Creek with you." She looked him in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "I am tired of running. Caleb, this is my home. You are my husband. We do not run from the truth." He looked at her, his face a mask of conflict. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw a strength that matched the mountains. "They will kill me," he said simply. "They will have to kill me first," she replied. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he took a deep breath. He set the pack down. He walked to the wall and took down her rifle, the Sharp's carbine. He handed it to her. "Then we do not run," he said. They heard the horses then, the sound of shod hooves on rock, the jingle of bridles. The posse rode into the clearing. They stopped, fanning out, their rifles held across their saddles. They saw the cabin, the neat garden, and the smoke from the chimney. Deacon Price rode forward. He saw Eleanor standing on the porch. She was not in chains. She was not in rags. She was holding a rifle. "Mrs. Harlow," the deacon called out. "Eleanor, are you safe? We have come to take you home." Eleanor stepped forward. Caleb was right behind her, his rifle held loosely at his side, his eyes scanning the men. Clarabelle stood on the other side of her mother, her arms crossed. "I am home. Deacon Price," Eleanor said. Her voice carried across the clearing, clear as a bell. The men shifted, confused. "Now, Eleanor," the deacon said, his voice placating. "You are not well. This brute has done something to you. He attacked Mr. Finch. He has stolen you away." "Stolen me?" Eleanor laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. "No one has ever been able to steal me, Deacon, but I have been owned." A murmur went through the men. "You speak of Mr. Finch?" Eleanor continued, her voice rising in power. "He came here to tell my husband that I was property. He came here to reclaim me, like a stray cow. Mr. Finch was upholding the law," a man shouted. "He was protecting Arthur's interests." "Arthur?" Eleanor's voice dropped, becoming dangerous. "You want to talk about Arthur Harlow? You want to talk about the man who donated your stained glass window? Deacon?" The deacon paled slightly. "You all came here to rescue me," Eleanor said, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the men. "Where were you for 18 years? She took a step forward, into the sunlight. "Where was this posse when Arthur Harlow broke 3 of my ribs because his supper was cold? Where were you, Mr. Miller, when he blackened my eye, and I had to tell you I'd walked into a door? You knew, you all knew. You just looked away. The silence was absolute, broken only by the stamp of a nervous horse. You want to talk about a brute? Eleanor said, her voice shaking with a rage that had simmered for 2 decades. Arthur was a saint in the street and a demon in the parlor. He beat me. He starved me. He locked me in the cellar for 2 days because I'd overspent on groceries by 5 cents. And when I cried, he told me it was the price of being his wife. The men looked at each other, their righteousness evaporating. They looked at the ground. They looked at the trees. Then I met this man, Eleanor said, gesturing back to Caleb. He has never laid a hand on me except in kindness. He has never spoken a word to me except in truth. He feeds me, he protects me, and he honors me. She turned and looked at Caleb, her heart in her eyes. This is my husband, she declared to the valley, by my own choice. This is my home. This is my life. She turned back to the posse. Now, she said, her voice dropping to a low, deadly command. Get off my land. Deacon Price looked stunned. This is slander. Caleb stepped forward. He did not raise his rifle. He did not speak. He simply took his place next to Eleanor, a mountain of a man, unmovable, his eyes promising a violence that the deacon's God could not absolve. One man muttered, She is lying. She is just covering for him. Clarabelle, who had been silent, stepped forward. She is not lying. The men turned. They had forgotten she was there. I saw the bruises, Clarabelle said, her voice trembling but clear. My whole life, I saw them, and I said nothing. We all said nothing. We all liked the silk sheets and the big house. We all let it happen. She looked at Deacon Price. She is finally free. Leave them in peace. That was the blow that broke the posse's back. The testimony of the daughter. The men looked at each other, deeply ashamed. This was not a rescue. It was an intrusion. Deacon Price looked at the ground. He could not meet Eleanor's eyes. Men, he muttered. Let's go. They turned their horses, no longer a righteous posse, just a group of embarrassed men. They rode out of the clearing, their retreat far quieter than their arrival. The last horse vanished into the trees. The clearing was silent. Eleanor stood for a long moment, staring at the empty trail. The rifle in her hands grew heavy. She heard the sound of her own breathing, ragged and sharp. Her knees buckled. She dropped the rifle, and it clattered on the porch boards. She would have fallen, but Caleb was there. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She turned in his arms, buried her face in his shirt, and the sobs finally came. They were not the sobs of a victim, but the gut-wrenching, cleansing sobs of a warrior who had finally won the war. Caleb held her. He said nothing. He just held her, his large hands stroking her hair, his own body trembling with the adrenaline of the fight they had not had to fight. Clarabelle stood apart, watching them. She saw them collapse into each other. 2 broken, terrified, strong people, and she knew she was witnessing a love she had never understood. They were exhausted. They were terrified, but they were still standing. And they were together. The summer came to the High Valley like a benediction, after the siege of winter and the turbulent, muddy wrestling of spring. The long, sun-drenched days felt like a gift from God. The land, which had been a canvas of white and gray, exploded into a riot of color. Purple lupine and red paintbrush flared across the meadows. The aspens, once bare skeletons, were now thick with trembling green leaves that hissed in the afternoon breeze. The homestead thrived. The garden Eleanor had carved from the rocky soil became their testament. Rows of green beans climbed the rough poles Caleb had set for them. Squash vines sprawled across the earth, their big yellow blossoms promising a heavy yield. The corn, planted in hills with fish heads for fertilizer, as Caleb had shown her, grew thick and tall, a dark green wall by the side of the cabin. Eleanor changed with the season. The woman who had arrived pale and bound by whalebone and propriety was a distant memory. Her dark hair, worn in a practical braid down her back, was now streaked with gold and copper from the relentless sun. Her skin was the color of healthy, browned bread. When she swung the axe to split kindling, The muscles in her arms and back moved with a fluid, capable power. She was no longer just surviving. She was flourishing. She had learned to read the land, to know the sky. She knew which mushrooms were safe to eat after a rain, which herbs would soothe a cough, and how to set a snare line for rabbits so cleanly that the animal never suffered. She was stronger, freer, and more fiercely alive than she had ever been. The fear was gone. The ghosts of Bitter Creek, the memory of Arthur's hand, the shame of the town's gossip, they had all been burned away by the high-altitude sun, scoured clean by the hard, honest work of living. Their intimacy settled into this new rhythm. The frantic, desperate coupling of the first thaw had gentled, evolving into a connection that was as steady and essential as the creek that gave them water. One night in July, the heat of the day lingered, turning the cabin into a stifling box. After the supper dishes were cleaned and the goat was milked, Caleb took a heavy quilt from their bed, too hot inside. He said, he spread the quilt on the soft, pine needle-covered ground 100 yards from the cabin, in a small clearing that looked out over the valley. The stars were a spill of diamonds, so bright and close they looked like holes punched in a black velvet sky. They lay on their backs, side by side, not speaking for a long time. They listened to the sounds of the summer night, the chirr of crickets, the distant, lonely hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of a deer moving through the underbrush. "Eleanor," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. She turned her head. He was looking at her, his face serious in the starlight. "Are you happy here?" It was a question he had never asked. His proposal in the stable yard had been one of need. Their life since had been one of survival. Eleanor reached out and laid her hand on his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart. "I have never," she said, "not in all my 38 years, understood what that word meant until I came to this mountain. I am not happy. Caleb, it is not a big enough word. I am full." He let out a long breath, a sound of profound relief. He rolled toward her, propping himself up on one elbow. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the line of her mouth, the new strength in her jaw. He bent his head and kissed her. The kiss was not desperate, as it had been during the fever. It was not possessive, as it had been after the fight. It was tender. It was a long, slow exploration of a territory they both now knew by heart. It was a kiss of absolute belonging. He undid the simple ties of her nightgown, his rough fingers gentle. She helped him with the buttons of his shirt. There, under the vast, silent watch of the stars, they made love. It was quiet. It was complete. It was a prayer, a thanksgiving, a sealing of the truth that had been forged in fire and ice. They moved together with the rhythm of the breathing earth, two separate souls who had become one strong, indivisible thing. Afterward, they lay tangled in the quilt, the cooling night air washing over their damp skin. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, her arm slung across his scarred chest. "I love you, Caleb Bracken," she whispered into the darkness. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her so close she could feel his heart resume its steady beat against her ear. "I know," he said, and he said it with the voice of a man who was still stunned by his own good fortune. Clarabelle left 2 days later. The week she had spent in the cabin after the confrontation with the posse had been a quiet education. She had watched them, had worked alongside her mother in the garden, had even allowed Caleb to teach her how to mend a fence post. She found them by the creek, washing the morning's dishes. "I am leaving," she announced. Eleanor looked up, her hands dripping with water. She did not look surprised. She simply dried her hands on her apron and faced her daughter. "Back to Bitter Creek?" Eleanor asked gently. Clarabelle shook her head. "No, I cannot go back there." She looked at her torn, muddy skirts, and then at her mother's strong, calloused hands. "I went to the mercantile in town. I bought lace and velvet, and I felt nothing. I gossiped with the other girls about who had the richest suitor, and I felt dirty. It is all a lie, is it not? The fine clothes, the polite dinners, it is all a game. to hide the fact that everyone is either bored or cruel. Eleanor did not speak. She let her daughter find the words. "I watched you, Mother," Clarabelle said, her voice dropping. "I watched you stand on that porch. You were terrified, but you did not back down. You were a queen." And I looked at Deacon Price and all the men who used to tip their hats to us, and they were just small. They were small, frightened men. She looked at Caleb, who had been standing back, giving them space. "He is a good man," she said, her voice soft. "He gave me coffee. He wrapped me in his coat. He did not ask for anything in return." Caleb nodded once, accepting the compliment as the simple truth. "I am going east," Clarabelle said, "to St. Louis, or maybe all the way to New York. I want to find something that is real. I want to build a life that is not based on appearances. I want to be strong, like you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. They stood there for a long moment, a mother and daughter who had finally, truly, seen each other. Caleb packed a bag for her, with jerky and a small pouch of coin from his fur trade. He would ride with her to the pass, to ensure she met the stagecoach safely. As Clarabelle mounted her horse, she looked back at the cabin. It was not a hovel. It was not a sty. It was a home. "Will you be safe?" Clarabelle asked her mother. Eleanor smiled, her hand resting on Caleb's arm. "I am safer here than I ever was in your father's house." Clarabelle nodded. She looked at them one last time. This wild, beautiful, impossible pair. Then she turned her horse and rode away, not looking back, her face set toward her own future. A week later, Caleb asked Eleanor to walk with him. The work was done for the day. The sun was setting, turning the granite peaks into burning spears of orange and purple. He did not take the trail to the creek. He led her up, higher, to the meadow where he had first taught her to shoot. The place was covered in wildflowers, a carpet of yellow and blue. "Caleb, what are we doing here?" Eleanor asked, laughing, as he tugged her by the hand. He did not answer. He led her to the center of the meadow. He was nervous. She could feel the tension in his hand. He was wearing his clean shirt, she realized, and he had washed his face and combed his beard. "Eleanor," he started. He stopped, cleared his throat, and started again. He looked at her, and the raw honesty that she had first seen in the Bitter Creek Mercantile was there. But this time it was not awkward. It was focused. "The first time I asked for you, I was a fool," he said. "I was a lonely man, looking for a warm body. I asked for a girl who looked soft." He took both her hands in his. "Now I am asking to be a better man, because I am not looking for a soft woman. I am looking at the strongest woman I have ever known." He let go of one of her hands and reached into his pocket. "And I am not asking for a woman to keep me warm. I am asking for a woman to share my life, to share my fire." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening. Caleb Bracken dropped to one knee. He held her gaze, his own eyes shining with a fierce, terrified hope. He opened his hand. In his rough, scarred palm lay a ring. It was not gold or silver. It was a simple band of dark green mountain stone, soapstone, that he had carved and polished until it shone with a soft, warm luster. He had inlaid a tiny, bright fleck of gold he had panned from the creek, setting it in the center like a star. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick, "be my wife, not just for the winter, for always." Eleanor looked at the ring. She looked at the mountain. She looked at the man kneeling in the wildflowers. The man who had saved her, the man she had saved. Tears streamed down her face. They were not the tears of a victim. They were the tears of a soul that had finally found its harbor. She knelt in the flowers in front of him. She took his face in her hands. "I already belong to you." "Caleb," she whispered through her tears. She was weeping too hard to speak, so she just nodded, again and again. A frantic, joyful motion. He let out a ragged breath and surged forward, catching her in his arms. They clung to each other, kneeling in the dirt, two halves of a whole, as the last light of the sun blessed the valley. They were married 3 days later. under the shade of the massive pine tree that stood guard over the cabin. There was no deacon, no judge, no crowd of witnesses. There were just them. Eleanor wore her best calico dress, the one she had sewn herself, and she had woven a crown of wild columbine and lupine for her hair. Caleb wore his clean shirt and had trimmed his beard. They did not have a Bible, so they faced each other, holding hands. "I, Caleb Bracken," he said, his voice deep and steady, "take you, Eleanor, to be my wife. I will hunt for you. I will protect you. I will build for you. And I will love you until the mountains fall." "I, Eleanor Harlow," she replied, her voice clear. "Take you, Caleb, to be my husband. I will stand with you. I will work with you. I will be your home, and I will love you until the stars burn out." He slid the stone ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. A hawk screeched overhead, circling in the blue sky. A family of deer, 3 dogs and a new fawn, emerged from the edge of the timber, their ears twitching, watching the ceremony with liquid brown eyes before bounding away. Caleb cupped her face. He kissed her, sealing the vow. It was a kiss that held the promise of 1,000 sunrises, of firewood stacked high, of shared silence and knowing glances. It was the kiss of forever. The first snow of the next winter began to fall in late October. It came softly this time, not with the rage of the previous year, but as a gentle promise. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the hearth. The room was warm and smelled of roasting venison and drying herbs. The shelves were full. Sacks of flour and beans were piled high. Jars of preserved berries lined the mantel. The cabin was ready. Eleanor sat at the table. The ledger, her journal, was open in the golden pool of light from the tallow candle. She dipped her pen in the ink. She wrote, October 28th, 1883. "The snow has come again. Last year. I feared it. I saw it as a prison. Today, I looked out the window, and I saw a blanket. I see peace. I see the beauty of a world at rest." She paused, looking at her hand, at the dark stone ring on her finger. It was scarred now, from work, but the little fleck of gold still shone. "I was once a ghost in silk, a polite smile in a cold house. I was a name, a possession, a whisper of a woman. Now," she smiled, the lines by her eyes crinkling. "Now I bleed when I cut my hand. I burn from the sun. I ache from a day of good, hard work. I live." She looked up. Caleb was sitting on the other side of the hearth, mending a snowshoe. He looked up at the same time, as if he had felt her gaze. He smiled at her, a slow, easy smile that was just for her. She dipped the pen one last time. "And I am loved." The fire crackles. The wind began to howl outside, the wild voice of the mountain testing the strength of the walls. Caleb stood, walked over to the table, and put his hand over hers. He leaned down and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of profound, gentle respect. The wilderness howled, but the cabin stood strong. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope it keeps you hooked. Please, take a moment to comment and let us know where you are listening from. We love to see how far these tales travel. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to From Wild West, so you never miss a new story. We would be honored if you would share your thoughts on Eleanor and Caleb's journey in the comments below.